Jenna?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's me.
So I'm going to ask every panelist just to start out with, what type of a reader are you?
Well, I read pretty much anything that's fiction. There's nothing really that I don't enjoy reading. I do read some nonfiction as well, but primarily I review fiction books online. And then I also, with my job as a contract editor and writer, I often get stories sent to me, bios, things like that, that I will read through and edit and stuff. So I'm kind of all over the place with my reading.
So there's not a particular genre then that you prefer to read?
No, I'm pretty open to anything. I write women's fiction, so I do read a lot of that genre, and reviewing it just because people who enjoy what I review would enjoy what I write. But I enjoy all types of books, thrillers, mysteries, self-help books too. I enjoy now and then, but yeah, I just any type of book.
Well, thank you for being on the panel. Holly Schofield? I thought I was going to do a really good job of your last name. And here it is. Yours was the easy one. Retirement hobby, writing science fiction, and you've become obsessed. You have 80 plus short stories that you've appeared in Analog, Lightspeed, and Escape Pod, among other places, and you hope to save the world through science fiction and homegrown heritage tomatoes. Wow. Heritage tomatoes.
That's right. They're just coming right now. For reading, I used to read a wide variety of all kinds of fiction. As I get older, I realize I can't read everything in the world, especially with so much good fiction being published recently. So I keep getting narrower and narrower in what I read, which may or may not be good, but it's a matter of time, I figure. So I read a lot of science fiction these days, anything from steampunk to soap opera, or space opera, not soap opera, to the hard and crunchy science fiction. And I try and expand my horizons a little bit into the more literary side of things, picking up some tips there. I also read mysteries, and I read and write sort of slipstream or crossover fiction, science fiction mysteries, for example, or historical science fiction, that sort of thing. So I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Oh, thank you for being on the panel. Laura Van Arendonk Baugh. Did I do that right?
That was very good.
Yes. You, award-winning speculative fiction is what you write, best-selling nonfiction, and you've ascended extinct, dormant, and active volcanoes, but none has accepted your sacrifice. I'm sorry. That should have been way more funny. You live in Indianapolis with your husband, dogs, imaginary friends, and a prepper stash of dark chocolate, which turned out to be a good plan for 2020. No kidding. No kidding.
I'm running low on my stash, though, so I make no promises of my good behavior. Because, yeah.
And how about you as a reader?
I've noticed that my reading habits have changed dramatically over the years. And currently, well, let me just own up that in 2020, my habits have changed because I was doing a lot of my reading via audiobook in the car, and what are cars today? And so my reading habits have changed even more this year, but I'm wide open to all kinds of different genres. I actually probably take in more nonfiction than fiction because I find that nonfiction really drives my own fiction. So yeah, I'm kind of all over the map.
What about a genre?
I like quite a few different genres. I mean, I write largely in, different flavors of fantasy, but I will read fantasy, sci-fi, mystery, all sorts of things.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for being on the panel.
Thank you.
So I'm Jennifer Cockton. I'm the founder of Online for Authors, and Online for Authors is a glorified admin for authors. We actually help online with your content, your social media platforms, with newsletters, database management, website edits, and all kinds of fun stuff. So I love doing interviews. I love reading. I love interviewing authors and sharing them with the world. I help with book promotions and that sort of thing. So when it comes to my reading, I read a large range. I can read unpublished, unedited, fiction, nonfiction. I love reading series, especially like cozy mystery or crime thrillers. They tend to, I have some very fond character. I've fallen in love with a few characters in the different series. So that's my background for as far as reading and who I am. But my job here is to moderate the panel. So in doing that, I'll just ask, Jen, I'll start with you, and what is the number one distraction that you have? The one thing that every time, no matter what, in the reading you pick up on?
Yeah, it was kind of funny. I like in doing a bit of research for this panel and talking to other readers and writers and stuff, it's funny the list that comes up, because I feel like everybody, some things that bug other people won't bug, everyone necessarily. I think the main, what people has in common is grammar and spelling, obviously, is a big one for most readers, I think. But for me personally, I find when there's an overuse of similar phrases and descriptions to be very distracting. Like I was reading a book and the author kept describing the character's eyes over and over again. Specifically, she was saying her eyes welled with tears. And then every time that came up, it would kind of jar you out of the story. And you're like, oh, okay, again. And it was just kind of like this thing that kept taking me out. And then once you notice it a couple times, and it's just like so glaringly big, but like other people in my book club, they didn't even notice it until I pointed it out. But for me, I always notice if they're describing the same thing in the same way, it just completely takes me out of the story.
Yeah, thank you for that. Holly, Laura, who wants to jump in on that?
For me, it would be plot logic. You take the classic TV sitcom episode where it's all about miscommunication between two people and they run around and things happen because one doesn't know what the other one knows. Why don't they just tell each other? It drives me bananas. So any sort of plot contrivance like that, or plot logic where people should have just done the simplest, most easiest thing and they just choose not to because that extends the book into a series of 3. That thing throws me right out. So for me, it's the overarching things rather than just the small typos and things. I can look past that probably because I've done a lot of critiquing on not rough drafts, but not completely polished drafts either. And I can look past the typos and the grammar errors and things like that. But just don't give me illogical plots.
Thank you. Laura?
Factual errors. They knock me out immediately. And my day job is of a sciencey bent. So I noticed pretty quickly when I'm like, oh, you did your research by watching a Hollywood movie, which are known for getting everything factual. And that's, it just immediately pulls me out and I have to stop and be like, okay, let me make this work so it'll work for the story. Okay, fine, keep going, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So that's a great point that you make, because I know that a lot of the sessions actually at When Words Collide are bringing in experts that help us do the realism in writing. The one, I think it was 2018, there was actually a weapons session where there was actual firearms and you could actually see the gun, touch the gun, and get a really good sense of exactly what it is when somebody was describing a gun in a book, how it was for somebody who's actually really knows their stuff and is interested in the book for that reason, it would totally throw them. So your science background would definitely cause some lack of research or realism to be an issue for sure. So the other one I have a question about is that, are you primarily reading fiction? And this is a question to all of the panelists and whoever wants to jump in. When you're reading fiction, are you reading it for the purpose of escape?
Yeah, I think fiction for me is definitely an escape, kind of a break from reality and you know, a way to go places that you can't go in your real life. And that's partly why I love fiction so much, is you get to do and experience all these things through the written word. And it's pretty cool.
And that's exactly why I'm in science fiction as well, because you can take present day world and not extrapolate exactly, but imagine what would happen if we all had telepathy, or if we could all fly, and extending that to fantasy. What if we could do magic spells? And then you can examine the human condition through that by, if we had telepathy, how would society change? And that's examining human nature to its bare bones, is what it's really doing. So for me, it's escapism and relaxation, but it's also sort of an investigation to boldly go, in other words.
So I'm going to complete the arc that we started here with escapism to with investigation and escapism. I'm going to say that for me, it's mostly a way to engage. I absolutely get to go places I don't normally get to go. That's one of the joys of fiction, but I'm not doing it to escape from life. I'm doing it to engage with my life in a different way. And that is in no way throwing shade at escapist readers. My mom right now is plowing through vintage cozies at an extraordinary rate because of the situation that we're living in at the moment. Great. I'm glad she has a healthy coping mechanism. It's way better than smoking, but it's not, some of us are using this to process life in a different way, not truly escapism, but just an engagement on a different level. I think all of those are, I think we'll all engage in different versions of that at different times, even as the same reader.
It's fun that fiction can kind of do both. It helps you kind of understand yourself and others in a deeper level, and even put yourself in other people's shoes and stuff, while also providing just a way to kind of just shut down what's around you just for a little bit. It's kind of one of the joys of books, I guess.
And there's research out that demonstrates that the more you read, the more empathetic you are in personality, and obviously there's a bell curve and whatnot, but just it's fascinating that engaging with fiction and going and talking to those imaginary friends make you better able to engage with people in real life.
So here's something that I find as a reader that bothers me, and it may be overlooked a lot with regards to maybe writing as an author. I mean, when you get down to being an editor or having editorial experience, and there's so much to be said about building a relationship and hiring a great editor. You can definitely tell when a book's not edited. And you can definitely tell when there's maybe not enough emphasis that has been given to create a relationship with your reader. So if we could talk about some of those relationship elements that you found that have kept your attention in some of your reading. So that's okay. With regards to building relationships, so is there enough engagement, enchanting? Is there enough empowerment or embracing the reader to continue to read?
I stop reading stories sometimes, and I put the book down or the story down and don't finish it, is I feel that the reader-writer contract has been broken, in that I didn't get into the world, I didn't feel for the characters, I wasn't immersed into it, and for some reason I'm just not into it. And I think that's fair enough, because what writers sometimes need to learn is that the reader is on their side. The reader is not out to find fault and poke holes in it. And the reader is very forgiving and will overlook a lot of things. And you can take any top 10 novel from any genre and poke holes in all kinds of things and find flaws. And of course, it's not perfect, but it grew to the top 10 because people were willing to look past its flaws, because there is some other strengths there. So if you as a writer can have certain strengths and do things very well, then other things can fall by the wayside, because the reader is always on your side looking for that immersive experience.
Mm-hmm. I think trusting the reader is intelligent enough to figure stuff out too. When you're reading a book and it's over describing things, they don't trust you to know what they're talking about, and they kind of talk down to the reader. For me, that can be quite a big distracting, and it can make your novel slow down and get pretty boring, you know, if you have to over explain things. And then also it kind of doesn't, sometimes it doesn't go with what the character would do or say in real life because they want the reader to understand something. I think that can be kind of a distracting thing as well. And another one that kind of people, when I was talking to other readers and writers, were saying is when the writer tries to come across as over intelligent and using big words and stuff to impress, that can often take readers out because then they gotta try and even like look up what the writer is trying to say. Where when I went to school for journalism, they taught us to write articles at a grade 9 reading level, which is kind of crazy, but that's what the majority of people have a reading level at. So I think oftentimes simplest is best, and just trusting that your reader can figure out what you're trying to say without having to over explain everything. But it probably depends on the reader too. Like if you are a person who loves, you know, the science of everything, you probably love the breakdown of, you know, all the explanations. But for me, often those are the paragraphs that I kind of skim by. So yeah, I think probably depends a little bit. But.
Well, and I think a lot of that too is very, very genre specific, right? I mean, if this is contemporary romance, do not explain to me how the Orion Drive works. Like nobody cares, okay? But if that's, you know, if it's hard sci-fi and you're like, and then they went to the, you know, the far out, the outer meteor belt where it was really crowded with meteor, and you're like, no, that's completely bogus. Like, you know, obviously you're going to need to match to your genre. And I think, I mean, that's, we know about genre expectations. And I see a lot of advice presented of this is the right amount of description, this is the right amount of dialogue on a page or whatever. And those are very rarely given with the appropriate genre context to them. So there's a lot of flexibility. Just know your market, I guess is what I would say there.
Mm-hmm. So talking about proper content on a page, what about font size?
Talking about submissions or?
Like isn't it published when someone publishes a book and they're looking to get to say the book under a certain number of pages to publish and they decrease the font size? That's one that bugs me.
I'll tell you right off that I was given a book to read and I looked at it and said, my eyes are not good enough for this. And I've never read 2 words of that book. So yeah, that's real.
I grew up on the Penguin pocket books and tiny yellowed pages and old books from public libraries. So for me, it doesn't bother me at all. I'm happy to have you know, a Kindle where I can enlarge the font, but I don't necessarily need it. I don't care if it's printed on a dot matrix printer. I don't care. I've sort of gotten past that. But I do look at the quality of the binding and things like that to see if it's cheaply produced, because that can be a key to a lot of things to do with the quality of the publisher and so on. And there are some very cheap published ones that I do like, and then I look for those as well. So again, it comes right down to everybody's different on that, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I've noticed a question here in the chat, and this is from Michael. It is suspense of disbelief an SF and F thing, or does it apply to crime, romance, mystery as well? Not sure how
that's everything.
Okay.
If I can answer first, one of my friends writes mystery novels, and of course I write fantasy, so you wouldn't think there's a lot of crossover, but one of the things she talks about all the time is in the amateur sleuth trope, like, no. There's a serial killer wandering around murdering people, and this person with absolutely no background or, you know, law enforcement or fighting or any training for this is like, oh, let's go find this mass murderer. And she's like, no, the smart person would go get tacos. Like they don't go and chase the murderer. So you have to have a reason to get your amateur sleuth into that position. But that is completely a suspension of disbelief in the exact same way that I ask for it in fantasy. Because let's be honest, if I'm in a building with somebody who has killed 7 people so far and he's looking to make me number 8, I'm going to leave. Okay, so that, you know, to make your reader believe, oh no, the natural thing to do is to stay there and try to fix this in some other way. There has to be some plausibility there in the writing, and then there has to also be a willing suspension of disbelief in the reader. There's a contract. It's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the other thing I was going to bring up was and where did it go now? It was there's a fine line between giving too much information and then making the reader guess or assume. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I think that the classic thing there is the white room syndrome, where the first 2 pages of the story, people are talking and you don't know if they're on a spaceship or a submarine or what they're doing and why they're there. So giving some setting in the first couple of paragraphs, giving some indication of what the character's goals are in the first few paragraphs, just grounding the reader in where they are. You do have to trust the reader, but you also have to give them enough pertinent details that they don't have to sort of rewind and reset where they think they are in the story.
Yeah, I think that just looking at the questions here, there was a question, at what point does the jargon and terminology present in many SF and fantasy novels become a distracting factor instead of something that enhances the story? I think that kind of ties in. I think that if, the big information dumps is what can lose a lot of readers, and then it just becomes too much. But if it's presented naturally, and then you don't have to stop and explain something in kind of a way that breaks the flow of the story. I think, when you have to explain something in these big, paragraphs to catch the reader up, then it becomes quite a bit of a distracting and feeling like you're reading almost a textbook instead of the natural way to do it. And it's like, as a reader, I don't mind times when I'm not quite sure and it gets revealed later on how something works, or like, in fantasy, often, it's a whole new world and the culture, something is revealed later and you go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, you don't have to explain everything as it happens. It just, as long as it's like a natural flow, I think that's what's really important and what readers enjoy.
I think there was a comment there about when I talked about Escape and asked the question about if we read for Escape that, someone had said evolve versus escape is what the word that they prefer. But at the same time, in reading fiction, we're talking about fiction, but because we read both, but I don't want to be made to think or to have to retain information on such a level that I feel like I'm going to school.
I find that with the Game of Thrones books, there's too many characters, there's too much description, there's too many setting changes, and yeah, it's like going to school, and I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to read a book that has a family tree in the back, as some books do, or even that has a prologue, which is probably why I prefer short stories, is because my attention span is shorter than some people. So yeah, for me, there is a limit to the jargon, the terminology. In a 5,000 word science fiction story, you don't want more than 1 or 2 words of jargon. You don't want more than 2 or 3 short paragraphs of info dumping, as it's called. And by that, I mean more of an info trickle, where the information is there and it's dribbled out differently than it would be in fantasy, as Laura touched on. So yes, there is a limit, and the way to figure out at what point that occurs, which the question is to read every story that you like and figure out exactly numerically how much jargon they used and terminology and how long an information giving paragraph was, and sort of just crunch the numbers on it, and you'll be surprised what you learn. Take some highlighters and go through it in different colors, highlighting pens. And that's sort of the way that I've sort of pieced together the standards of each genre, because they are different. And to my mind, Margaret Atwood does not write science fiction because she's touching on more literary tropes and more literary style, and not emphasizing the things that would be emphasized had it been true science fiction.
Mm-hmm. So just to respond to that, I write epic fantasy, so there's the disclaimer. That is your classic, phone book with the family tree and the maps and the by the way, here's the appendium with all the explanations in it. But even coming from there's ways to do it well, and there's ways to do it less well. And so actually prepping for this panel, I wrote down, I'm working through a story right now, set in China, really good story. But the character names are, let me check my notes, Cha, Cha, and Chen. There's a UA and a UA on opposite sides of two different political parties, and a duo and a duo. And I'm sorry, I'm really trying hard, but that's incredibly hard to carry with me as we go. Ways to have a huge character spectrum, a big cast, but also make it easier on your reader. Please don't do that to me. I'm not smart enough to do that. So.
Yeah, that's something that came up even just talking with people who write romance or women's fiction. If you have names that are too similar, it can get confusing for the reader. And then, like, it's something that I didn't even think about or even was aware of. But when you point it out, you have to go back and think, who is this person again? When it's like a Sarah and a Sally or something like that, even in romance. But I think, having, there's a fantasy series that I love to read, and I reread it every couple of years, and it's big books. It's a whole, new world. But every time I read it, I learn something new, or I understand it better, and I enjoyed it the first time, and I still enjoy it because, you may not catch everything the first time around, and that's fine. And I would rather reread the story and learn more again than to have, the author have to explain everything to me and then I just get bored and quit, So I think that's one of the strength of fantasy, that they're great books to reread.
Can you please stop whoever's doing that? I'm trying to listen and enjoy. Thank you.
I'm just going to have to remove that one. I don't know how they got off mute, to be honest.
And while she's doing that, I'll answer the question there. What about italics for thoughts? Do they help or do they hinder? For me, it kind of depends on the genre. For middle grade, some italics are acceptable sometimes. For older, I believe YA, and for adults, italics are out of fashion right now, partly because deep point of view is in fashion. So putting it in italics makes it stand out, makes it less immersive into the protagonist's or main character's head. So for me, rather than saying she thought that guy was crazy, would be pretty distant. If you just put that guy was crazy in italics, then it's also pretty distant. But if you just put man, was he crazy in regular font as part of the internal thoughts of the protagonist, then you're probably about as deep as you can get. So doing it that way, and when I revise, I strongly go through and look for that sort of thing where I've said, she thought blah, 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 and I'll change that and take out she thought, or take out the italics that I put in the first round. Trying to go as deep as you can go, simply because it's what I prefer to read, and also because it is coincidentally in fashion.
I think there's a kind of a mixed way you can also use italics for thoughts. So when my character is talking to herself, I would put it in italics as like a thought that came into her head, like come on, Jenna, you can do this. I'd put that in italics. But if it's like her kind of thinking about things, I wouldn't put it in italics. So I think you can kind of use a mix of it almost, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I like a minimal amount of italics. I find italics to be somewhat distracting, especially if it's not, like you said, to be an internal thought prompt. They could be really overused. What about punctuation that gets overused?
Well, I think, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say, I think with italics and with punctuation both, it's not that it's inherently a good or a bad idea. It's that so often they are poorly used, and so you kind of get some bleed over reaction to it. So an example I'll just pull out from nowhere. You mentioned, man, was that guy crazy? Or she thought that guy was crazy, but they'll put that whole sentence in italics. No, that's just stop. And and that's pretty overt example. But things like semicolons, and the semicolon is a valuable tool, but it is often used poorly. So you get people saying, well, then semicolons, just never use them, and anyway, I don't know. I'm just a big fan of use it well. There's my soapbox.
And I think if you do put something in italics, you don't have to add she thought. The italics says
Right.
that. Yeah. So I think that's something else that you can kind of check. But I did read somewhere that someone said that you should only use like an exclamation point once or something. I found that very hard to do in my novel because like it's a way to get across emotion and stuff, but overusing it is very distracting because you should be able to hopefully convey the emotion and the feeling with the way you're writing, how the character is saying it, as opposed to having to throw in an exclamation point.
Yeah, I know that Jonas, when he was doing his editing, Jonas Saul, for those that don't know Jonas, he did mention that 5 or less exclamation points in any story. And this comment here too from the chat says, I was in a panel with Jonas Saul. He said italics slowed the pace and to remove them, but I have a story set inside of a person where there are 2 people inside and the person in the person, and it's to differentiate from the people outside talking out loud. Would there be a better way to do this instead of italics and still keep clarity? Keeping in mind this.
I can answer that one.
Yeah,
I can answer that one. I was on the panel actually with Jonas, and he writes thrillers, and he doesn't want to slow the pace, and he doesn't need that tool in his toolbox, so he doesn't use italics. However, the person writing this question has 2 people inside the person and wants to differentiate them. And I would say use italics, definitely.
Absolutely.
When I've done internal thoughts. I've used it when it's artificial intelligence inside somebody's head speaking to that person. I've used them when it's an intercom between 2 people in 2 different rooms, or a radio and that sort of thing. So yes, they do have their place, and it sounds like this person who's asked the question, that is one place where you would use italics. So it's not the never ever rule. It depends on the circumstance.
Remember, they're more like guidelines, right? to borrow the phrase. Now, I get twice as many exclamation marks as anybody else because my books are twice as long. Okay, everything is guidelines, and then adapt it to your individual needs. So
the one thing I do get distracted by, again, is boring words and the stuff that's not as descriptive as it could be, like walked, talked, turned. That was brought up also in Jonas's panel. And I want to be engaged, I want to be encouraged to move forward in my reading. And if I'm finding the words boring, I don't want to have to look them up, but at the same time, I do want something that's a little bit more than walked, you know.
And again, that's about reader expectations.
Yeah.
It would depend on the cover of the book and what section of the store it's in, or what magazine the short story's in, or that sort of thing. For instance, if it's in Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazine and it's about a murder, you might expect some forensic words and so on. Related to that, I keep a list of what I call weasel words, words that I often use, of which walk and turn and glance are some of them. And when I go through and revise, I deliberately bump those up, change them around, paraphrase them, use thesaurus.com as a starting place to give me ideas of what I could be saying instead. So I work my way through that list, and there's other words on the list like just, everything is just that, or under just then, or so make up a list of your own weasel words and watch out for them, because you can fall into too many ruts of phrasing things in the same way.
Okay, so that I was just going to read this. So I came across a Goodreads top 5 most abandoned books, and they put out a cover, and actually 5 covers of books, and the different expectations was one reason that readers abandon a book. Another is it's not for everyone. So if it's not general enough, if it's in a genre but it's very, very specific, it's like at a nano or micro genre attached, and then it's only small demographic of readers for it. The other was the cover doesn't match the content on the inside of the book. So maybe a reader picked up a a book and thought it was going to be this type of a story, even from reading, the back part or looking at the cover, and then it turned out to be something quite different. And then hard to get into. So the one book that they mentioned that it was hard to get into was Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. So that surprised me quite a bit. Anybody want to speak to those?
I was hoping we would touch on writing the other, or reading from other cultures that aren't our own, that aren't North American, because Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, I believe, was translated, and some of the English is sort of stilted, and I couldn't get into it either, and I figured out it was the translation process. I'm sure it's wonderful in the original language, and I wasn't too keen on the story anyway, but like I said, I don't finish things if I can't get into them. So again, reading widely, reading outside your genre, reading as much as you possibly can, so that you're not just conditioned to know one form of English. Americans that read Canadian works sometimes stumble over words and things because they just haven't read widely enough. So imagine a Nigerian writer today trying to get published. It is tough because it's a different way of doing prose and a different style and a different plot.
Mm-hmm.
The way that we can support writers trying to get off the ground is by reading widely and expanding our horizons.
So there's a quick question in here that says, how far into the novel do you get to establish the reader contract expectations? And I've heard something that says the first line, but anybody else want to talk about that?
So I think expectations and hook sometimes are used interchangeably, and they're not the same. Like, you don't have to give me, everything I need to know about this plot, on page 1. However, on page 1, I should have an idea of what the mood is, what the tone is of the story. And if I don't have that on page 1, I'm assuming I'm not going to get it, and I'll quit. I mean,
yeah, it takes a lot for me to quit a book once I've bought it and I sit down to read. Like, I hate leaving a book half finished, even if I'm not particularly enjoying it. I just I gotta get this book done. So it takes a lot for me to throw it away. But often when you're perusing books and you're buying a book, you often will read the first paragraph. And what will make me put a book immediately down is if a character has to, in like a dialogue, will be explaining something to another character just to get this info dump background story all mashed in the first page. Like, a kid says to another kid, look, we weren't close to dad, and I know it's his funeral today, and I know he was a bad guy, and it's just like this. And then I read, I'm like, okay, like, that'll make me not even buy a book. But yeah. I think a lot of readers, they want to read the book if they bought it. I don't know, that's just me. I hate having a stack that I couldn't finish, and it's happened a few times, and I'm like, I'm a failure, I can't do it, But that is the thing that I just can't get past when they do that.
Justine says she's the same, even if she's not enjoying it much. She's not one to put it down.
Yeah.
But I'm fickle that way. I'll put them down. I won't continue reading something that I don't enjoy because to be honest with you, I really don't have time. And having said that, the book has to be moving quickly, and there has to be enough action in it for me that I'm not falling asleep. See, I want a sleepless night when I read a book. I want to pick it up and not be able to put it down until I'm done.
For me, for a narrative hook, what I'm looking for is the how and the what. Okay, some people are trapped in a cave and they have to get out, and I'll be all engaged. I don't need to know why they're in the cave or what happened before that. I just need to know that they're trapped and they want to get out, and that might be enough. So leaving the why out of the first bit can pick up the pace and hook the reader.
Well, we've got 5 minutes left. Is there anything that's burning for any of you that you'd like to speak to with regards to distractions as a reader?
The one thing, and it's on my mind because I just read a book from a really well-known author. I was really excited to try him. And in his dialogue, he always would say the other character's name. So it's like, we need to make a good plan, John, because if we don't, John, we're going to be in trouble, John. And it's like, no one says people's names when they talk. Not really, And so every time I would come to a dialogue part, I had to like skip over the name, and it's just like making. And that's something when I went back to my own writing, I was like, oh no, I did that. And I think you write that way, like, Carol said blah 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 blah, or hi Carol, and you don't even realize you're doing it, but you have to write how you would say it, because it can throw the reader out, because it's not natural.
That would be my final point too, is always read your manuscript aloud, because you'll find things like that. It'll find unnatural phrases, it'll find the stumbling blocks. If you have a computer read it to you, you can even find plot holes and things that you won't otherwise see visually. So having it aloud can really help with almost every kind of distraction.
Yeah.
Laura, have you got anything you want to share?
I would just say I'm a big fan of the rules are actually guidelines, and you can get away with a lot by understanding the purpose behind them and then bending them where appropriate. Picasso could do photorealistic art, but he didn't get famous for that. But when I do bad art because I don't understand how to do it well, it's just bad art, and nobody pays millions of dollars for that. So if you know the purpose behind the rules, you can do whatever you want. There you go. I give you permission. Go.
So the one last thing that I feel like is just this burning thing for me is that as a reader, not a writer, not an editor, an overdeveloped secondary character or more developed secondary characters, because it could be more than one. Does anybody want to share anything about that?
I think that's a classic we see at movies all the time, where the secondary character steals the show simply because they're a better actor, and therefore they've defined the character better. So if you're finding as a writer that your secondary character is taking over, maybe that should be the protagonist, and maybe you want to totally think about that a little harder.
Or spin-off.
Yeah. Any other distractions we want to share in the last 3 minutes here of the panel?
There's one good one that was shared to me with my writer group, and it's how did they say it? Being true to the mindset of your character at the time. So her example was, if your character's running for her life and is describing the beautiful sunset around them, you wouldn't be doing that in that particular moment. And that can really, if you're super depressed about life but describing the wonderful, I don't know, rainbow that's so beautiful, like just keeping in the mindset of your character, because if you don't, it can take you out of the story. I thought that was a pretty good point.
It's a really common one too. Really common one.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for being part of When Words Collide in this panel, and helping writers understand how to keep the reader's attention, and all the wonderful information that you've shared. And also to Danita for hosting. And we'll just check in the chat one more time for any questions that might be left. But that was a fantastic panel.